What's up, guys? Welcome to Roensch Capital Charts. Today we're taking a look at Nvidia stock, ticker symbol NVDA, on a variety of time frames in anticipation of the next trading day, Friday, March 15th. Alright guys, Nvidia here today, down $29.44 a share. That's minus 3.24% in regular trading hours. It is down about an additional 6 points or so here in the after hours, but listen, if you've been watching for any period of time, you know what I'm about to say, right? We have to take after hours with a massive grain of salt. I have a big monitor in front of me, and I can barely see that. Okay, if you're on a phone, you are probably struggling to see that volume after hours, comparatively speaking to the intraday volume. Stocks can get bullied very heavily, and pumped for that matter, very easily, after hours. Listen, take with a grain of salt whether it's in your favor or going against your current sentiment. Now, let's get started here with our daily ritual, the volume profile analysis here on the 5-minute chart. What we're doing here is trying to pull out some bias, some sample size bias out of the market that we don't necessarily get simply by looking at the price movement. So we're looking for, of course, big volume changes that correlate with obvious moves in stock price, the most obvious moves on the day, which we'll circle here in a second. But it has to be, remember, out of context for what is typically expected during that time of day. So let's look here and see if you would circle the same things that I would here. I'm looking for this little pop and dump off the open. I want to compare that then to, well, let's see if we can circle all that here, to all of that on that little bounce back upside there. Okay. I want to look at this dump and bounce at the low of the day, this little grind higher in the kind of later lunch hour, and then this move into the close here. So we have quite a bit to look at here today on Nvidia. And let's start here as always, or as typical, from left to right. So you can see here that the opening bar is where it is, okay, and that's typically, it's very common to see that be the highest volume bar of the day. Was not the case today. What we actually got on the pop was decreasing volume on the top out candle that we saw there, the third 5-minute bar of the day, or I'm sorry, the third 5-minute bar of the day. The top out candle was the second 5-minute bar of the day. On that third began the downside move, and on that fourth bar, we saw massively increasing volume, right, along with that short-term reversal candle that we did see. Now, you guys know, I like to see, ideally, 3, maybe even 4 or more consecutive candles that have consistently higher volume out of context. But being that we saw 1.6 nearly million shares traded on each of these 5-minute bars when off the open, we only got less than 1.5 million. I think it would be perhaps a little bit biased or ignorant to say that the bears certainly did not, set the tone at that point of the day. Because they did. We saw the bears set the tone here with this big red candle. And if the volume was lower, it'd be something to talk about. But we saw a little bit of a pop. Although we didn't see 3, 4 consecutive candles, sometimes we have to go outside the lines a little bit and say, okay, this one's clear here today. Now, interestingly here, while that did, of course, set the tone, the closing price of Nvidia was actually very close to the bottom of that large red candle. So by the time that selling pressure was over off the open, right, that little pop and dump, that pop and fade off the open, by the time that was over, the bears actually the bulls kind of actually held their own pretty well for the remainder of the trading day, especially in the second half. Well, let's now take a look at this middle of the day, or kind of a late morning move that we saw, at least my time zone, Central Time. Now, what's interesting here, and I don't want anyone to lose sight of what I'm looking at, what's interesting on this middle one here is that we saw a pop, and I know a lot of bears would look at that and say, look, it's a repeat of what we got off the open. I don't agree with that, because what we have to look at is we got increasing volume on that dump off, and the highest volume bar, really the only one that is out of context compared to this time of day, at least considerably so, is the low of the day, with a wick, a relatively sizable wick on the bottom of that candle, which tells me that since this bar happened to be red, the volume bar, of course, is red, and that looks very scary. But being that it was the low of the day and a larger downside wick, this tells me that there was a bit more of a battle going on there, especially that we got the reversal shortly after. So I would go out of my way to say I think a lot of the volume pop on there was actually buying volume and less definitive from a bearish perspective. So I can't give that one to the bears. You know, I'm sorry, but the truth is that was a battle, pumped up the volume. Now on this mid-afternoon upside move that we saw, I thought this was pretty interesting because we don't expect very much volume this time of day. We did get, though, a little bit of out of context buying pressure on these, 7 consecutive green candles. And again, this is typically one of the much lower volume periods of the day. And then as soon as that move was kind of over and the stock started to fade a little bit down the backside of that move, we saw volume start to fade a bit as well. So this is interesting. I think this is really when we saw the bulls kind of claim their ground and say, hey, we're going to take control here in the early afternoon. Not necessarily with a massive move back upside into the close, but kind of planting their stake and saying, like, hey, listen, we're going to put up a fight. The low of the day maybe in here. And it was, you know, we consolidated a bit more, and then heading into the close, we saw that little bit of a dump and pop again. The bears giving it one last shot, and the bulls reclaiming before they were able to really even get substantially below 670, let alone, 870, let alone lock in a new intraday low. But truthfully, guys, as far as the volume profile in that late day move, there's really nothing there that's extraordinarily out of context. Again, as is typical, this first bar after the closing bell, you can see that's very large volume. That's about 2.25 million shares traded on that 1 5-minute bar. A lot of times, this is going to be, at least my belief, is that this is going to be fund rebalancing, institutional rebalancing. This is very common, and we've seen it especially a lot as of late. And it's, again, especially common in blue chip stocks that we see this, which leads me to believe that it's rebalancing being done upon the closing bell. But again, the fact that this is after hours and the candle itself is relatively small, I think we're looking at a little bit of a battle, a lot of both sides, which pumps up that volume substantially. Now, let's move on here to the 30-minute chart and start taking a look at those self-fulfilling prophecy psychological levels heading in to tomorrow's trading day, Friday. Now, as we discussed in yesterday's video, by the way, hey, listen, if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. I'm covering Nvidia every single day as of right now, and will continue to do so for as long as it remains interesting, I suppose. We discussed in last night's video how we had kind of sloppily held that 200 period here on the 30-minute chart. Again, listen, these are all, the only reason I'm interested in any of these at all is because 1, the 30 minutes is a very popular chart, and 2, the 50 period and 200 period moving averages are the most popular indicators you could possibly slap on a 30-minute, 4-hour, or daily chart. So I want to look at what has the most eyeballs. And yesterday we talked about how we gave up that 50 period, right off the open on pretty big volume. And then we held, but it was relatively sloppy, that 200 period. Today we were really looking for another test of that 50 period since we saw a sloppy hold, then a reclaim more so, of that 50 period heading into yesterday's close. That's Wednesday's close. Now today, in pre-market, well, really after hours and this morning pre-market, we gave up not only that 50-day yesterday, but the 200 period in pre-market. Again, pre-market, the volume is very low. We have to take that with a grain of salt. So what I was interested in when I was looking at Nvidia this morning was, okay, hey, what are we going to see off the open here? We made a huge test up above that 200 period. We got near the 50 period as it was curling back downside. You know, bears, that is something you guys were looking for here today. And it rejected both on pretty substantial volume there. So looking ahead now to tomorrow, the stock is currently about 2.1% away from a retest of that 50 period moving average here on the 30-minute, and it's about a 2.9% move away from that 200 period. So listen, today was a 3.24% day on Nvidia. Both of those are well within reasonable expectations for a one-day move on Nvidia. It's a pretty volatile name, especially as of late. So listen, bulls, from that perspective here tomorrow on the 30-minute in particular, I mean, I got to say, I'm looking for a reclaim of both of these levels. And these are so heavily watched that there are likely millions of other people, including institutions, funds, algorithms, looking at this exact same chart when looking at the 30-minute in particular, kind of thinking that same thing for a best case scenario, at least day to day, for a bull. Now, bears, what is your best case scenario tomorrow? How do you ensure at least the most comfort in terms of your positioning? Well, ideally you would avoid giving back 2%. But listen, any retest of that 50 period you're going to want to see a hard high volume rejection, meaning bulls, that's what you would not necessarily want to see upon any retest. If you're a bull, you want to see a break upside through both of these on big volume, right? Like we typically talk about, a pullback on low volume, a retest, and a hard high volume pull away. Ideally getting that 50 period curling back upside, back above the 200 period. But bears, you guys, ideally any retest of that 50 period, whatever volume it tests, it's already on your side. Whatever volume on the test doesn't necessarily matter in my eyes, as long as that rejection is big and on high volume. Last thing for you bears, getting this 50 period to continue curling downside as aggressively as possible, to claim as much downside ground as possible each day, that's an important thing for you guys. If you're a bear, you want those psychological barriers to be as low as possible. Like bulls, when we talk about how after a big upside move, we want the as many psychological barriers as possible, or potential support levels, I suppose, to get up underneath the move as quickly as possible. Bears, you want that ceiling falling with the stock, holding it down, so to speak, adding a little bit of doubt into a bull's head. Okay, and you bulls, I think it's very important to understand the psychology of the other side. I always say, oftentimes more so than your own, I think it's very important to do so. Now, let's move on to the 4-hour chart and see if this is contextual, and it absolutely is. This catches my eye immediately. Today, it's a first day break. Okay, you guys know I'm a 1 to 3 trading day kind of guy. Ideally, 2 or 3 trading days and big, more macro level breaks and holds become more meaningful and more definitive in my view. But here on the 4-hour chart, you can see that we just as recently as March 11th made a big bounce off of that 50 period here, and today we gave that up. Okay, into the close, we kind of gave that up and then retested it upon the close. So bulls, this is a very small move. Doesn't take a lot to reclaim that, less than 1%. Bulls, best case scenario. Even if we're unable to crack 900 tomorrow, obviously that would be a better case scenario. We'll get to that on the daily. Any close back above that 50 period tells me that the market is watching the 4-hour, which I already know that they are. It's very popular. And that we haven't really decided that we're ready to give that up yet. Bears, really simple for you. We have now spent a little bit of time with that on your side, meaning the 50 period here on the 4-hour. Two things. You want to see that 50 period start to flatten out. It's the 4-hour chart. It's going to take some time, right? It's a lot slower than the same 50 period moving average on the 30-minute chart. But you guys, you bears, would like to see that thing start to flatten out, and a hard, big volume rejection. Listen, ideally it would occur off the open and sustain throughout the day if you're a bear. Okay? But listen, either side, whether you're a bull or a bear, as much time as possible spent on your side of this moving average, since it is so incredibly in play right now and heavily watched all around the world by big money and a lot smaller money, the more time the better, okay, that it spends on your side. The more definitive that decision, I think, becomes given a longer sample size of time and a bigger sample size of volume. Now, let's get super contextual. The most important chart, ready? The daily. All right, this is the biggest one of the day. This is the most important one, and it paints the most clear picture. Now, the 4-hour, don't get me wrong, it is very important. But the daily chart has the most eyeballs. Okay, undoubtedly so. There are more people watching the daily than the 4-hour here on Nvidia. And you can see, of course, the 50, the 200, completely irrelevant here on the daily, so we don't care about those right now. But do you notice a big change from yesterday? We gave up $900 a share, right? And yesterday, the big talk of the town, at least here on the channel, at least from me, was $900 a share. And I think that's the obvious story again tomorrow, along with $850. Listen, bears, ideally, you guys would love to see a downside break of $850, but understand that's going to take over a 3% move. Okay, we've seen much crazier things out of Nvidia. 3% seems to be nothing for Nvidia as of late, but it's not a 1% move. It's not a 0.25% move. It's going to take another relatively bearish day to get down there. And bulls, slightly less. Okay, we're looking at about a 2.2% move to reclaim 9. But reclaiming 9 is the goal. ASAP, as soon as we possibly can, reclaiming 9 would be a beautiful thing. I think people forget that we recently tested about 840, really tested that 850 level and bounced hard back above 900 in a single day. This thing can do a lot, right? So bulls, the story tomorrow, hold 850 upon any test. get back and close above 9, ideally spending as much possible above 9 as we can. As much possible time, I should say. Bears, exact opposite for you guys. Any test of 9, you want to hold that as a rejection. Make that break downside of 9 a little bit more definitive day by day. And ideally head down for a downside break of 850, similar to how we broke 9 today. Implied volatility on Nvidia here today. Listen, it is down a little bit today. Understand though, it is still a little bit high compared to the last few months, so IV crush is still a potential risk there if you are someone who has purchased options recently or still holding purchased options, especially if they're usually 3 months or less in expiration is when that gets to be a little bit more sensitive. Which brings us now to my favorite part of the video, and I know a lot of you guys as well. What was the bias out of the options traders here today as they position themselves heading into tomorrow, Friday? So we had about 1.67 million total contracts traded. Pretty good sample size, not bad. We had 1.04 million calls and 632,000 puts. That's a pretty call-heavy bias, isn't it, right? And if we look down here at the delta ranges, the in-the-money contracts, that's 61 to 80 and 81 to 100 delta range, those are actually relatively undecided, but the volume is lower because those are more expensive. Naturally, people buy less. Okay. But at the money, out of the money, and far out of the money, all of those. So a more midterm sentiment and a very short-term sentiment, right? That 0 to 20 delta range, I think, is the most contextual for videos of this style. That's why I typically am focused on that one, because on average, it's going to be a much higher concentration of those short-term speculators. 416,000 calls today and 237,000 puts. Relatively heavy call side bias in the short term as well as the overall call per ratio. Listen, if you want to get my daily scalp setup alerts, swing trade setup alerts, human verified by me, by the way, unusual options activity, and platinum one-on-one coaching with me, take a look at those 4 membership variations at that link in the pinned comment. I think you'll find it extremely useful. Don't get me wrong, I learned myself how to trade for absolutely free. It did take me a little longer and maybe cost a little bit more money than I think it should have, my tuition to the market. But if your goal is to try to expedite things, I think this could be a good option for you. If you want to try to do it for free, more power to you. I encourage you to do so. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.